Okay, today we are going to talk about comparative and superlative adjectives. But before we start with all of that, I just want to review. What is an adjective? An adjective is a word that describes. So if we try to think of some examples of adjectives, big, small, purple, fun, pretty, we use adjectives in English all the time. And one way we use them is to compare two or more objects. These are called comparative adjectives and superlative adjectives. Now on this chart over here we can kind of see an example of how these are used in English. For the most part, we add ER to the end of an adjective or EST. Here we're not comparing anything at all. All we're saying is that this is a dark cloud. Now when we compare two things, this cloud to this cloud, we add ER to the end of our adjective. This is a darker cloud than this one. When we have three objects to compare, we add EST to the end of our adjective. This is the darkest cloud of all three clouds. Here's another example. We're not comparing anything here, but we are using an adjective. I brought a big gift. Here we compare two things, this gift and this gift. This gift is bigger than your gift, bigger than this one. When we have three objects, we add EST again. I brought the biggest gift of all. So if we try to remember the simplest rule of all for using these adjectives, we either add ER to compare one thing to another thing, or we add EST to compare one thing to two or more other things. Now, unfortunately, it's English, so it's not always that simple. There are different exceptions to that add ER and add EST rule. But here's another example for you, just of the simplest way to do this. So we look at our comparative adjectives, which is when we are comparing two objects to each other. We add ER to the end of our adjective, and, this is important, we add the word than. For example, this book is bigger than that book. We added ER to big, and we added than. Over here, when we're comparing three or more things, we use a superlative adjective. So we add the word the, then our adjective, and then the ending EST. This book is the biggest. So it's the biggest of 3 books, of 4 books. It's the biggest of all. Now if we start to look at some of those exceptions to the rule, to the add ER than rule, we first have to look at adjectives that end in the letter Y, which there are many. For example, the adjective pretty ends in Y. Now we still add ER, but we have to change that Y to an I and add ER afterwards. So pretty becomes prettier, I-E-R. When we have adjectives that have 2 or more syllables, we cannot say ER. So if it has 2 or more syllables, we cannot say interesting-ist, interesting-er. No, it's just too hard to say. It's just too many syllables for me to say in one word. So instead, we add more than. He is more interesting than me. So we do not say interesting-er, he is interestinger than me. Nope. We say he is more interesting than me. So if you're thinking of using an adjective that might be more than 2 syllables, you can always check using the clap test. Interesting. Ooh, that's 4 syllables. I better use more than and not ER. Now if we have a word like nice, Okay, one syllable. I think it's safe to use ER than. Okay, so that's a really easy way to check that one. The exceptions to the rules are very similar for superlative adjectives. If your word ends in Y, change Y to I and add EST, just like you added ER over here. So just as prettier has IER, prettiest is IEST. It's just a spelling rule. Same thing as over here also. If your word has 2 or more syllables, instead of adding more, because you're comparing 3 or more things, you're going to add most. He is the most interesting man in the world. Interesting is 4 syllables, so I'm going to say most interesting man in the world. Okay, so there are a lot of exceptions to using comparative and superlative adjectives, but if you remember these important ones, and you remember to check these key ideas, you're already on your way to using them correctly in English. So let's just review before we finish up. Here are some things to keep in mind as you write or speak with comparative and superlative adjectives. First, you must ask yourself, how many objects am I comparing? Am I comparing 2 objects? Am I comparing 3 or more? Am I comparing at all? This is the first thing you need to ask yourself. Number 2, does my adjective end in the letter Y? Obviously, this is more important if you are writing, but if you are writing, remember, change that Y to I and add ER. Next, ask yourself, does my word have 2 or more syllables? If it does, remember you're going to say more interesting or most interesting. You'll not say prettier with YER. You will not say interestingest. Whew, that's hard to even say. So always keep these things in mind. Lastly, and I think most importantly, you always have to choose one change for your word. So if you are adding the word more or most before your adjective, you are not also going to add ER or EST. For example, you will never say more nicer. You just say nicer. You will never say most prettiest. No, because you already changed the word pretty to add that EST. So you will not do 2 changes by adding most. You will always just choose one change. Now, comparatives and superlatives can seem difficult to start with, but really they almost work like a formula. And if you remember these exceptions and key ideas, you'll be well on your way. Thank you.